Chapter 256, Yin-Yang Two Forms Sword Array. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. Holding the inscription pen, Zhang Yuochen continuously poured his genuine qi into it. His mind was empty as his spiritual power was completely immersed in the world of the 6th level array's inscription. Boom! Loud rumbling sounds resounded from outside as the attacks raged on. The whole underground palace shook violently. Hanku was standing nervously beside Zhang Yuochen. She did not dare to make a sound, afraid that she would interrupt him. Almost 2 hours had passed before Zhang Yuochen finally put away his inscription pen. Only then he realized that he was soaking wet from sweat. Zhang Yuochen heaved a long sigh of relief. He then retrieved spiritual crystals from the spatial ring one after another. He inserted these spiritual crystals into the small pits of the stone wall. The pits on the wall was completely filled after being embedded with a total of 864 spiritual crystals. Now, this the final move. It's sink or swim. Zhang Yuochen placed his palm on the stone wall and poured his genuine qi into the inscription of array. The genuine qi flowed along the inscription of array, activating the 864 spiritual crystals on its way. Those spiritual crystals were constantly twinkling, almost as if hundreds of bright stars themselves were embedded in the stone wall. Swish! Line after line, intersecting one another, suddenly appeared on the stone wall. The lines were as dense as a spider web, forming a defensive array. We did it! We did it! Zhang Yuochen laughed heartily. Hanku was thrilled. She could not help but gaze upon Zhang Yuochen with more admiration than ever. Zhang Yuochen, you did a terrific job. This is something that even the array masters from the Yuntai suzerain couldn't achieve. But you did it. It's really nothing. I've only repaired about 6% to 7% of the 6th level array. But it should be enough to block Huo Jingqing. Now we can focus on recuperation. We'll slowly come up with a solution to deal with Huo Jingqing after recovery. Zhang Yuochen smiled and said. Hanku sneaked a quick glance at the ring on Zhang Yuochen's finger. He took out hundreds of spiritual crystals from that ring. It must be a space treasure. Hanku thought to herself. After hesitating for a moment, she had decided not to ask about the ring. After all, it was Zhang Yuochen's secret. If she took the liberty to ask, Zhang Yuochen might misunderstand her, thinking that she was greedy for that space treasure. As expected, Huo Jingqing could not barge in under the protection of the array. After 2 days, Zhang Yuochen had finally fully recovered. The wounds on his body were completely healed, leaving only faint scars. The genuine qi in his qi had also restored to its optimal state. Not only that, it was somehow even stronger than before. After the recent series of battles, Zhang Yuochen noticed that the sacrifice power inside him had completely fused with his genuine qi. Unknowingly, he had reached the peak of the dawn state of the Earth realm. It's really amazing how the sacrifice power can be fused so quickly in the midst of battles. I'll merge the power through battling again when I get to absorb the sacrifice power next time. Zhang Yuochen took a glance at Hanku, and he soon realized that she was still recovering from her injuries. Her injuries were more serious than Zhang Yuochen's, so it was natural for her to take a few more days to heal. Another day had passed, and Hanku had fully recovered. The moment she opened her eyes, bright lights could be seen shining within her dark pupils, radiating off a strong spirit pressure of martial arts. As she withdrew the genuine qi back into her body, the lights in her eyes also disappeared, returning to normal. She turned her attention to Zhang Yuochen and saw that he was carving something on the ground. So she walked over and stood behind him, glancing down at the ground. A mysterious yin-yang 8 trigrams was carved on the ground, surrounded by rows and rows of tiny text. 2 little figures with swords could be seen battling in the trigrams. What's this? Taking a deep breath, Hanku awakened her sword comprehension realm. She converged her spiritual power before fixing her gaze on the trigrams again. This time, she found that the 2 little figures seemed to have come alive, levitating off the ground. They kept swinging their swords, exchanging moves and taking steps. Even their sword techniques were skilled and ingenious. The Yin-Yang 8 trigrams kept revolving as if it was alive. Sword comprehension maneuver, Hanku exclaimed in surprise and said, Oh, you have attained such a high realm. I suppose you are not far from Heart Integrated into Sword. Heart Integrated into Sword was the legendary realm of sword technique. Hanku's attainments on sword technique had far surpassed that of her peers ever since she was a child. Even her father believed that she had the potential of becoming a saint. She was known as the most outstanding sword genius in Yantai suzerain in the last 100 years. Even when she lost to Zhang Yuochen, she thought that he was just slightly better than her. If she worked harder, she could definitely surpass him. It was only now that she realized the difference in the realm of sword technique between Zhang Yuochen and her was too vast. Ignoring the look of surprise on Hanku's face, Zhang Yuochen pointed to the trigrams on the ground and said, "This is a Yin-Yang two-form sword array. Only two highly accomplished warriors in terms of sword technique can unleash its full power. We are both at the peak of sword following the mind. So, if we can perform this array, we can definitely kill Huo Jingqing." "Are you asking me to learn this now?" Hanku frowned and said, "This array is very complicated. I probably need a year or so to fully master it." Even at a glance, Hanku was able to tell that the array was indeed profound and mysterious. Zhang Yuochen replied, "You don't need to fully master it. As long as you can perform 1/10 of its power, we can easily defeat Huo Jingqing. I'll give you 3 days. Judging from your talent, that should be enough." Hanku turned to look at Zhang Yuochen, her expression one of slight confusion. She said, "We also have some joint arrays in Yantai suzerain, but a minimum of 3 people are needed to perform the arrays. On top of that, they also need the help of the array Jade Stone to bring their full power into play. Don't tell me that you want to defeat Huo Jingqing with a sword array that can only unleash 1/10 of its power, and without the help of the array Jade Stone?" Zhang Yuochen answered, "The role of the array Jade Stone is to merge the genuine chi of the embattled warriors through the inscription of array. But the Yin-Yang two-form sword array doesn't need the inscription of array. Instead, it uses the sword comprehension between the two warriors to merge their power together." "I see," replied Hanku. Any other warriors could not comprehend the mysticism of sword comprehension connection. However, Hanku had attained a high cultivation in sword technique. It was no surprise that she immediately understood when Zhang Yuochen had only briefly mentioned about it. Zhang Yuochen continued to explain the mysticism of Yin-Yang two-form sword array to Hanku, hoping that she could master the array as soon as possible. The Yin-Yang two-form sword array takes human as its base, the heaven and earth as its compass, and Yin-Yang's mysticism as its power. If two warriors cooperate perfectly and reach the sword comprehension connection, they can arouse the spiritual chi from heaven and earth. The power of human is limited, but the power of heaven and earth transcends everything. As long as we can arouse the spiritual chi from heaven and earth, nothing is beyond the realm of possibility. When setting the array, you and I are the yin and yang in the array respectively. Yang moves, and yin moves along. Yang stops, and yin stops along. The array is paired with 18 sword movements, namely 9 yin sword and 9 yang sword. As for other moves, we'll have to adapt to the situation and act accordingly. I believe that with your talent, you can practice the 9 yin sword to the beginner level in 3 days. With her arms folded across her chest, Hanku raised her eyebrows and said, "Don't underestimate me. With my talent, I can easily reach the beginner level in just 1 day. 3 days are more than enough for me to practice the 9 yin sword to the level of small success." Zhang Yuochen looked at her and said, "The Yin-Yang two-form sword array is no easy feat, otherwise, it won't be known as the most powerful twosome sword array." Back then, Kai Yao and I. Speaking of this, Zhang Yuochen suddenly stopped mid-sentence. He smiled bitterly to himself before continued saying, "I've carved the moves of the 9 yin sword here. You can start practicing now. As for how much you can perceive the techniques, it depends on your comprehension ability. Ask me if you have any question." Zhang Yuochen walked to the other side of the underground palace as soon as he finished his sentence and began his practice of the 9 yang sword. Hanku stared fixedly at him for a while and said, "What an odd person." Hanku's comprehension ability was indeed very strong, which exceeded Zhang Yuochen's expectation. It only took her 2.5 days to reach the beginner level of the 9 yin sword. Of course, Zhang Yuochen was a huge factor behind this. Not only did he patiently guide her along the way, He also pointed out the mistakes she did over the course of her practice. Not keeping everything to himself, he selflessly taught her the tricks of the 9-yin sword. After reaching the beginner level of the 9-yin sword, only then Hanku had begun to really understand the profoundness of the Yin-Yang two forms sword array. Even without performing the Yin-Yang two forms sword array, the 9-yin sword itself was already much more brilliant and powerful than other sword techniques in the superior class of the spiritual stage. Even in Yantai Suzerain, there was only one sword technique in the superior class of the spiritual stage, and it was incomplete. That sword technique was regarded the strongest in Yantai Suzerain. However, it was nothing compared to the 9-yin sword. Earlier, when Zhang Yuochen first told her that the Yin-Yang two forms sword array was the strongest twosome array, she snorted at it. But now, she totally agreed with him. Yantai Suzerain's so-called powerful arrays were totally insignificant in front of the Yin-Yang two forms sword array. Hanku said, "It took me nearly 3 days to reach the beginner level of the 9-yin sword. I guess it might take me a month or longer to reach the small success. If other warriors were to practice this, they probably can't reach the beginner level even after a year." Zhang Yuochen said, "You've only reached the beginner level. At this point, it's still unknown whether we can cooperate well and perform the Yin-Yang two forms sword array." "Is it really that hard?" asked Hanku. "Try it and you'll know." Zhang Yuochen took out the Abyss Ancient Sword and stood inside the circle that he had drawn earlier. The moment he waved his sword, his aura completely changed. His back was so straight and his gazes were so sharp that he looked like a young sword god. Standing in another circle 10 feet away from Zhang Yuochen, Hanku pointed to Zhang Yuochen with the ancient white jade sword. Her aura was also completely different from earlier. Paired with her outstanding appearance, she resembled a beautiful sword fairy. They did not make any move, and yet, faint waves of sword breath had already appeared around them. "Move." Zhang Yuochen uttered one word and took 7 steps rightward. Each step was exactly 1 foot long. When Zhang Yuochen took his first step, Hanku also immediately moved along. Swish. As sword masters, the two of them moved at high speed in the array, performing sword techniques one after another. It was as if there were 18 figures in the array, and each figure was performing different sword techniques.